Hello, I'm Anthony Gaeddert. I've spent years piecing together the fragments of our past, and today I want to share the incredible journey of the Gaeddert family, a story of faith, resilience, and a search for a place to call home that spans over 4 centuries and across 3 continents. This isn't just a list of names and dates, it's a narration of how we went from the lowlands of the Netherlands to the plains of Oklahoma. Our roots from the Netherlands to the Vistula Delta. Our story begins in the mid-1500s. About the time of Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492 and Menno Simons was born just a few years later, the world was entering the Renaissance, a period of explosive growth in art and science. While the invention of the printing press began to spread the revolutionary ideas that would soon ignite the Protestant Reformation across Europe. The story starts in the early 1500s near Zurich, Switzerland. During the Protestant Reformation, a group known as the Swiss Brethren broke away from the state-sanctioned church. They were the first Anabaptists, believing that only adults should be baptized upon a personal profession of faith. This was the era of Martin Luther and the birth of the Lutheran Church, a time when church and citizenship were considered inseparable. The lowlands and the Spanish Inquisition, 1530s to 1550s. By the 1530s, the movement spread to the European lowlands, the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern Germany. Here, a former Catholic priest named Menno Simons became a prominent leader, and his followers began calling themselves Mennonites. Life at the time. In the Spanish Netherlands, the Spanish Inquisition was brutal. Over 1,200 martyrs died for their faith, 3/4 of whom were Mennonites. Your ancestors became known for their nonviolent way of life and their rejection of military service. To escape this, they fled to the Vistula Delta in Prussia, modern-day Poland, around 1550. They were welcomed because of their specialized skills. They were experts at draining marshlands and building dikes. For 2 centuries, our direct paternal line, starting with Heinrich Gaeddert, born 1740, and his son Heinrich Gaeddert, born 1760, lived and worked this land, turning swamps into productive farms. By transforming these worthless swamps into highly productive agricultural pastures, Mennonites not only secured their physical survival, but also made themselves economically indispensable to the local nobility who welcomed their expertise. The primary engine of this reclamation was the drainage windmill, specifically designed to move massive volumes of water upward. These mills functioned by using large sails to harness wind power, which rotated a central vertical shaft connected to an Archimedean screw or a large scoop wheel at the base. Without the persistent work of the windmills, the reclaimed land would have quickly reverted to swamp, literalizing the Dutch proverb that God made the world, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. Now, if you want to understand why our ancestors were so ready to leave Prussia for Russia in the late 1700s, you have to hear about the Potsdam giants. It sounds like something out of a tall tale, but for our families living in the Vistula Delta, it was a very real and very strange threat. King Frederick William I of Prussia had this bizarre obsession with creating an elite regiment of Grand Grenadiers. He didn't care about their tactical skill as much as their height. He wanted every man to be at least 6'2", which was massive for that era. He started requesting that Mennonite families hand over their tall sons as a gift to his regiment in exchange for the community's continued peace. For 200 years in the Vistula Delta, the Dutch Mennonites' language developed into the Low German language that they were surrounded by. Around the same time, Catherine the Great of Russia issued a manifesto inviting Europeans to settle in New Russia, offering free land and, crucially, exemption from military service. While our ancestors Heinrich Gaeddert were navigating the shifting borders of Prussia, the American colonies were igniting a revolution with the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. By 1787, as the young United States was drafting its future at the Constitutional Convention, our Mennonite community was facing its own turning point as the first families began the arduous trek from Prussia toward the Russian frontier. The Molochna Mennonite pioneers traveled over 1,000 miles from West Prussia to southern Russia, primarily overland using covered wagons or small 2-wheeled carts. These wagons were often drawn by 5 to 7 horses and carried the settlers' most necessary belongings, including livestock and fine furniture, cheaper, like walnut bedsteads and chests. While the wealthy could afford such transport, the poorest emigrants sometimes had to push or pull their own small wagons or walk the distance. The journey, which took an average of 5 to 12 weeks, was navigated with the help of Russian soldiers who served as guides and translators from the border to various stations. In a chance meeting with Tsar Alexander I on their travels, a meeting took place in a modest setting, likely near a village square or a prominent farmhouse. Unlike the stiff formal audiences of the Russian court, this encounter was surprisingly intimate. The Mennonite elders greeted the Tsar not with grand speeches, but with a simple, heartfelt welcome. They presented him with the traditional gifts of the land, a loaf of fresh bread and a bowl of salt, symbolizing hospitality and a wish that he would never know hunger. Upon hearing they were heading to the Molochna colony, wished them well, Wohl in German. This meeting so moved the settlers that they named their new village Alexanderwohl in his honor. Upon arriving in Russia, groups typically stayed at the Chortitsa settlement, the old colony, for about a year to overwinter, obtain provisions, and learn local farming practices before moving 60 to 70 miles further to their permanent homes in the Molochna colony. The village of Alexanderwohl was established in 1821. It was designed as a Strassendorf street village, where all farm homes faced a single street with about 20 farmsteads on each side. Behind each house, the land stretched out into long, productive fields where they raised sheep and grew wheat. Our family flourished there. My third great-grandfather, Johann J. Gaeddert, was born in the Molochna region in 1838. During this time, the community was surprisingly connected to the wider world. In 1853, diaries record them reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were fascinated by it because, as pacifists who valued freedom, they saw a parallel between the American struggle against slavery and the Russian system of serfdom that surrounded their colonies. By 1870, the Golden Age in Russia ended. Tsar Alexander II announced a Russification plan to end all special privileges, including our military exemption. We had 10 years to comply or leave. At the same time, America was calling. The 1862 Homestead Act had opened millions of acres of Western land to anyone willing to improve it for a small fee. Furthermore, American railroads like Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway were desperate to settle the desert of the plains in Kansas. They sent agents to Russia with circulars printed in German offering land for as little as $2.50 an acre. In 1873, a delegation of 12 men, including Elder Jacob Buller, traveled to America to spy out the land. They even secured an interview with President Ulysses S. Grant at the White House. While Grant couldn't personally guarantee a permanent military exemption, his interest helped pave the way for our mass migration. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. To create a demand for its services, the railroad set up real estate offices and sold farmland from the land grants that it was awarded by Congress for laying track. They hired a man named C.B. Schmidt, an immigrant himself, who spoke fluent German, and sent him directly to the colonies in Russia. Schmidt was a master salesman. He set up real estate offices across Europe and flooded our ancestors' villages with colorful circulars printed in German. These advertisements didn't just offer land, they offered a future. The railroad sold these grant lands for as little as $2.50 to $5 an acre, often on 11-year credit terms. They even built immigrant houses, long wooden sheds where families like ours could stay for free for a few weeks while they picked out their specific plots and built their first sod houses. In the summer of 1874, almost the entire Alexanderwohl congregation prepared to move. They sold their property, often at a loss, and traveled by train to Hamburg. Our cousin Dietrich Gaeddert, a prominent minister, led one group of 300 people across the Atlantic on the SS Teutonia, an old coal transport ship so dusty the passengers were covered in black soot. When they arrived at Castle Garden in New York on September 2, 1874, the local newspapers described them as quaint in their homespun wool garments. They didn't stay long. They boarded trains for Kansas, initially living in railroad sheds in Topeka while the leaders selected land. They eventually settled in Harvey and Marion counties, introducing Turkey red wheat, which would eventually make Kansas the breadbasket of the world. While the first large wave of Gaedderts arrived in New York in 1874, my direct paternal line took a slightly different path, arriving 5 years later. In 1879, my great-great-grandfather Johann J. Gaeddert, along with his wife and children, including my great-grandfather David Johann, who was just a teenager at the time, boarded the SS Switzerland. Unlike the earlier 1874 groups who often endured repurposed coal ships, the SS Switzerland was a steamship belonging to the Red Star Line. Even so, the journey across the Atlantic was no small feat. For weeks, they lived in the cramped quarters of steerage, carrying only what they could fit in wooden trunks, heavy tools, Bibles, and the precious Turkey red wheat seed that would become their lifeline. They weren't just passengers, they were a family in transition, suspended between the Russian steppe they had farmed for generations and an American prairie they had only seen in railroad circulars. Instead of the crowded docks of Castle Garden in New York, our line sailed into the port of Philadelphia. Stepping off at the Washington Avenue Wharf was a distinct experience. Philadelphia was the headquarters for the Mennonite Executive Aid Committee, a group of American Mennonites who had organized specifically to help their Russian cousins. Because of this, the arrival was often more orderly. They were met not just by city bustle, but by fellow believers who helped them navigate the language barrier and arranged for their passage on the Pennsylvania Railroad. From Philadelphia, they began the long rail journey west to join the earlier settlers in Kansas. This 1879 arrival was a pivotal moment for our specific branch of the family. While others had already begun breaking the sod, Johann and David arrived with fresh energy, eventually settling in the Alexander Wool community in Kansas before the call of the Oklahoma frontier drew them further south. They arrived in Kansas during the infamous grasshopper year, when drought and insects had driven many other settlers away. When they first reached a high ridge north of present-day Buhler, a grandfather in the group remarked in German, "Dies ist ja hier eine wahrhaftige Hoffnungsaue." This is indeed here a true hopeful view. Thus, the Hoffnungsau congregation was born. They built sod houses, introduced hard winter wheat to the state, and transformed the ocean of grass into a landscape of waving grain that remains today. When the federal government opened the Cheyenne and Arapaho lands in Oklahoma Territory, it was as if a pressure valve had been released. Our people saw it as a new, promised land where a man could still secure 160 acres for a small filing fee and a lot of hard work. Our family moved south into what is now Washita County. My great-grandfather, David Johann Gaeddert, moved the family to the Bessie and Cordell area. They were among the founding members of the Herald Mennonite Church, organized in 1899 near Corn, then spelled Corn, Oklahoma. Life was hard. My grandfather, John Gaeddert, born 1905, grew up on a farm near Bessie and later became a mechanic in Clinton. My father, Elmer Gaeddert, was born there in 1928, maintaining that same work ethic learned on the farm. He came of age during a period of great transition, witnessing the tail end of the horse and buggy era giving way to the machines that would eventually transform the plains. It was on those Oklahoma farms, working alongside his father, that Elmer developed the core philosophy that would define his entire life: to do the job right. Whether he was tending to the land or later in life designing structures, on New Year's Day in 1948, Elmer began a new chapter when he married Leona Ruth Culp in Clinton, Oklahoma. They built a life centered on hard work and service. Elmer didn't just stay behind a plow, he became an architectural engineer, a profession that allowed him to blend his inherited discipline with a keen technical mind. In the late 1940s, Elmer and Leona welcomed welcomed me into the world in Clinton. As a father, he was a quiet but powerful teacher. He didn't just tell me how to work, he showed me. When I was a boy driving a tractor or operating a combine during the wheat harvest, I was working under his watchful eye, learning that a straight furrow and a clean harvest were matters of pride. Ultimately, the family moved from the farms around Clinton to Oklahoma City, where I eventually settled. From the dikes of the Netherlands to the wheat fields of Oklahoma, the Gaeddert name has always been tied to the land and the faith that brought us here. This is our history, one of moving, building, and always looking forward.